Hello, students. Welcome to week 10. Week 10, we're going to be talking about spirituality and religion and counseling. This topic is one that I felt our text doesn't go into in any great detail and felt like we needed to add some additional materials, supplemental materials for you all to look at. I still don't feel fully that these supplemental materials cover this topic. The chapters you're going to read, the one is based in non-Western beliefs. There's one about Jewish individuals and one about Arab and Muslim individuals, which isn't quite focused solely on religion, but has a piece of that as well. I think that one thing that I highlighted on the module introduction page, 3 different podcast links, and the cultural humility and the light up the couch are a little bit more specific to certain religions, whereas the thoughtful counselor, I think it is, the Thoughtful Counselor podcast 173 is actually the one you're going to be listening to for your discussion post this week. And that one is particularly important because I think it does cover the topic a little bit better about spirituality and religion, sort of in general, and how we incorporate it into the counseling process. But this is definitely an area to continue to explore because it is a very important one based on different people's faith, religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, and customs. They may have different ideas about where their issues and stuff might be coming from or ways to address them. And it's important for us to work with the client in understanding their worldview and kind of what their take on it is. Again, we talked about this in week 2 with the cultural formulation interview. So I'm going to go over a little bit with the 3 chapters, but I do believe that that Thoughtful Counselor podcast really does cover this topic well. And so I want you to obviously focus on that in addition. Chapter 10 is, it's from the Sue and Sue textbook, which is a very popular one to use in cross-cultural, multicultural courses for counseling. And I'm sure that you've seen Sue, either Sue or Sue and Sue, referenced a lot in your textbook and other readings, and even in podcast. There's a really great podcast that he's on as well. So anyway, the chapter 10 is non-Western Indigenous methods of healing, implications for multicultural counseling and therapy. And it starts off with 3 very small scenarios of individuals who are seeking some assistance and different ways of looking at the concerns that they're having. It might be easy for someone to automatically say that this must have a biological component or this is, psychosis. But in reality, it's just the way that things are manifesting based on their religious or cultural beliefs. And so the chapter goes on to talk about specifically worldviews and cultural syndromes and what they might look like. And there's this nice little chart, table 10.1 on cultural bound syndromes. And of course, this is just a list of a few, certainly nowhere near comprehensive, but it discusses some of the issues that we saw in those first 3 little vignettes that are discussed and the ways that these kind of show up in different cultures and things like that. And so some things that they would be really helpful for us to be aware of. And again, we're not going to be able to be aware of all of these, but they're kind of helpful to have some idea that things like this exist, and we can kind of question the client a little bit further on those things, and then do that research on our own once we have an understanding of where they're coming from. The chapter also talks about the shaman and traditional healers as therapists and ways that there are commonalities between them. And this is important to know because if you have someone coming to counseling that comes from one of these cultures or perspectives that looks to the shaman or the traditional healer, they may have certain expectations of what counseling is going to be like. And so having a good understanding of this is really important as well. Next, the chapter goes on and it gives like a bit of a more detailed case study on the Nguyen family and asks you to think about whether this could be seen as a case of child abuse or not. And it kind of explores this topic with you and takes you through ways that, you know, sometimes the laws of our country, some of these beliefs and stuff may sort of go against some of the laws, or seem like they kind of butt up against those laws. And how do we really recognize whether or not this is truly a case of abuse or something like that, neglect, and at what point do we need to report, and at what point do we need to educate the families or work with them, and all of that. And so this is just one example of that to start thinking about. It continues to talk about the principles of Indigenous healing, looking at holistic outlooks, interconnectedness, and harmony, which are very connected to a lot of modalities and theoretical orientations of counseling. It discusses a belief in metaphysical levels of existence, which kind of ties into existential counseling, which we do as well. The acceptance of spirituality and life in the cosmos, examples of Indigenous healing approaches. And again, as you read through these, like the first one, for example, is from Native Hawaiian healing ritual. And you may see that some of these are very different than the work that we do, but some of them have a lot of ties to the counseling theories and practices that we're used to. And so they don't have to be so different or something that we completely, you know, push aside as not being effective. It talks about the Native American sweat lodge ceremony, and a lot of times pieces of this can be used in recovery centers and treatment centers that are residential. The dangers and benefits of spirituality, so kind of looking at ways that it can be helpful for clients and not, but also ways that it can be helpful in the counseling process and also not. And so what do we do with that? You know, what are the implications for clinical practice? And that's how the chapter sort of ends with that in the summary and some references. So chapter 19, moving forward, is about counseling Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. It starts off talking a little bit about some of the fear in the country and the ways that you know, our socio-political system has viewed Muslims and Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, and kind of lumped them into this category of not being good, or right, or like not truly being American. And of course, it doesn't go into that much detail about it, but we know that that is the narrative that we've seen. And so it goes into some characteristics and strengths, specifically about Arab Americans, and then it talks about Muslim Americans. It talks about cultural and religious values, sort of in general. Again, this textbook goes back to some of the stuff we talked about, the textbooks that have a very stereotypical general look at different ethnicities, identities, cultures, races, religions, all of that kind of stuff. And so, of course, this is not going to be true for all of the clients that we see that might have these identities, but they're sort of general kind of ideas. Talks about the family structure and values, again, kind of general, not necessarily related to all of the clients you're going to see, and what implications that might have. What are the cultural strengths within these communities? And then specific challenges, and it talks about stereotypes, racism, and discrimination that happens really frequently in these communities. Again, because of our socio-political climate and many of the other things that we've talked about so far this semester, and what implications that then has on these individuals and their life and existence, you know, here in America, and you know, how does that impact their mental health and mental well-being, and then what do we do with it when it comes into the counseling space? It talks about acculturation conflicts, which, you know, we've kind of touched on in a number of different ways, and this, you know, feeling or pressure to acculturate to the dominant culture, the dominant discourse of the day and of the location, and what implications this has for them and then for counseling space. And so again, it goes into implications for clinical practice that are brought up in this chapter summary, and some reference materials that you can continue to read and explore on this topic. These chapters aren't super long. In total, all 3 of these chapters only are 38 pages, so it's not a ton of reading, And again, you have some podcasts you can listen to this week as well. And so the final chapter that we're going to be looking at this week from Sue and Sue is chapter 21, which is counseling Jewish Americans. And one of the podcasts is also specifically on Jewish Americans, about the rise in the hate against Jewish Americans here in America. And so it starts off with some quotes and from different materials and sources relatively recently, since 2013. Talks a little bit about the history of Jewish individuals in America. And then it kind of follows a similar pattern as the last chapter, where it goes into some characteristics and strengths. Again, these are very general. They're not going to pertain to all individuals that you might see that hold this identity. And so their spiritual and religious values, ethnic identity, gender-related considerations that are apparent in the Jewish community. Again, very, very general overview of it. Cultural strengths, specific challenges like historical background and socio-political challenges, prejudice and discrimination that they may face. And I think that one important thing to note is that, with the Jewish community, Jewish can mean a religious perspective, right? Like religious faith. But it can also be a more cultural identity as well. And so there are definitely people who consider themselves to be Jewish by sort of their descendants, but or not descendants, their ancestry, but not necessarily practice the Jewish faith. And so one kind of sort of name that I can identify is Bernie Sanders is a secular Jew. He is Jewish by descent, but he does not practice that religion. I believe he identifies as an atheist. But so there are Jewish individuals by religion, spirituality, and then there are secular Jews. And so that's an important distinction to make, to not make the assumption that when someone identifies as Jewish, that has something to do with their beliefs and their faith. So this chapter ends up the way that the last few do, with implications for clinical practice, a very brief summary, and then some references for additional reading that you can do. And so again, it is 3 chapters, but they are relatively short. And then we have the podcast that the discussion this week is based on. That's going to be really important, I think, for this topic, and then some additional work. But again, because these materials are not exactly what I want them to be, they're not as comprehensive, this is definitely a topic to consider further. And I guess I forgot to mention that we're going to be looking at the ACERVIC competencies as well. And ACERVIC is the organization, the branch under the American Counseling Association that relates to religious and spiritual beliefs. And so their competencies are based in how we work with our clients in relation to spiritual and religious beliefs. And so taking a look at their competencies will be really helpful and beneficial for you in exploring this area with future clients. And so that is it for our video for this week. I look forward to talking with you again next week. Thanks.